So I want to thank everybody for attending the conference and my keynote presentation. I really appreciate the invitation to share some of my thinking and work with you, especially in this area. This is something that I'm very interested in. I'm a licensed architect in the United States, and I also have a PhD in social systems design. So I have kind of a broad background in design and design as it's related to architecture. You can get more of my background from my website that you see listed here on the page. And there'll be additional readings and things like that as well, if you're interested. So why I think this is so important now is that we obviously are going through a lot of changes, dramatic changes, and some of them a bit disturbing. The thing that we've discovered is that the world is more complex than we had imagined, probably more than we could have imagined, and that everything seems to be connected or influenced by everything else. And it turns out that architecture is related to systems in a very intimate way. Architects design systems, or they design components of systems. And the resulting buildings or environments that they create are all interconnected with larger systems. So it seems like it makes sense to frame this particular approach from a systemic perspective, and to try to find out how we can possibly begin to understand and intervene in some of the complex, dynamic, and what people call nowadays wicked problem settings that are in place. So this presentation is just a schematic overview. The most important thing to this is that to pay attention to are the headings and not necessarily all the detail, because we don't have time to go through the detail right now. But the nice thing about presenting to architects is that they're very sort of familiar with very complex communications and documentation. So they understand that in order to go through a design process, that there is a lot of information that's developed, all of it necessary for a very complex product to emerge in reality. So this presentation is a proposal, and it's responding to a very complex challenge, and that is to create a systemic design educational system for preparing nascent architects to be scholar practitioners. And all of that will be made a little clearer, I hope, as we're going along. But again, this is a systemic approach. It's a design approach to the design of design education. It's a systemic design approach to design education. It's an overview, it's schematic. So even though it will appear, some of the material appears in greater complexity than we're going to cover, I thought it was still important that be presented. So if you go back, if you want to go back and look at some of the slides and look at some of the things in greater detail. This is, again, schematic, and it's curated in that not everything obviously is going to be presented. It's just going to be suggested that there are these areas to pay attention to, and that have much greater detail, obviously, if you're actually going to go through a serious design process or creating a new pedagogical system for architects. So the point of this design proposal is to sort of begin the basic design approach of a systemic pedagogy for architects. And some of the conditions are that it will be for educating polymaths versus generalists and specialists, which is an ongoing conversation nowadays, which is better generalists or specialists. And actually for designers, it's better that they're polymaths. And the practice of architecture as scholar practitioners, that's nowadays, and it's been this way for a while, is people have sort of talked about either their take action or they're thinkers. They're blue collar, white collar, that sort of thing. Anyway, that's true for where the regions that I've come from and worked in a lot, like North America, Australia, Europe, Scandinavia, places like that. I'm not sure exactly what the tradition is for India, but anyway, for us, we've had this long tradition of those who do things and those who think about things. So we have had this split, and actually back in the Western tradition in ancient Greece, wisdom, Sophia, used to mean the wise hand. It meant thinking about what you were doing. And it was at one point in the Socratic era that Sophia was broken into those who made things and those who thought about things. And those who thought about things went to the top of the hierarchy, and those who did or made things went to the bottom of the hierarchy. So in this case, I'm going to make the argument that that's not a good idea to continue with that it's important for especially architects, but other designers, to think about what they're doing and to do what they're thinking about and not have that split between the two. So it's what used to be called the wise hand, or Sophia. So I'm going to try to make a case for reconstituting Sophia as the wise hand, and to introduce this idea that systemics are the logics of architectural design and are the logics of all kinds of design. And even though I use the term pedagogy in the title, actually more accurately it should say pedagogy and andragogy. So pedagogy is child learning and andragogy is adult learning, but the common usage of the term nowadays for education is pedagogy, but just keep that in mind, that it means both pedagogy and andragogy. So this educational schematic, this educational system would have both of those qualities in it. So in this case, the first steps in actually designing this system, the first one is framing and scoping what we mean by the terms and sort of what's the breadth, limits, and space of what we're talking about for the design. And the second step is formulating a design brief made up of performance specifications, no prescriptive specifications right now at all. Just we're going to be talking about performance specifications and primarily just examples of what performance specifications are. So I want to begin with framing and scoping, which is going to involve three different areas: systemic design, wide design, deep design. We'll cover that in greater detail. So I know you're not supposed to read from your slides, but this one I just like so much because it's a very important piece. So I'll read it to you and then make some comments as it's related, as I see it's related to architectural design. So anyway, there are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way. He nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, well, what the hell is water? So this is an important point for all of us in that we're immersed in a context to the point that we're not aware of what it is. We can't see, like the fish, we can't see the water because it's our total environment. So want to ask the question then, what the hell is architecture? It's something that we don't typically learn. I discovered we don't learn in design, architectural design schools. It's not something that is reflected on in any great depth. The schools I've attended or taught at in architecture, it's strange that the schools have been either attached to colleges of engineering or colleges of art, or they're standalone schools. So it's pretty clear that people don't really know what it is. Is it engineering? Is it art? Is it something that's has integrity and unity on its own? So I want to talk a bit about that and sort of make some choices of what to discover or to look at in greater depth. So first of all, there's this idea that architecture is an applied science and or it's a practical art. And there is a lot invested in these two approaches to architecture. The sunk costs for both are pretty incredible. There are numbers of schools around the world dedicated to an approach to architecture as a science or as an art. There are journals, there are organizations, there are all sorts of reinforcing systems that support these two different approaches to architecture. What I'm interested in is I'd like to introduce this notion of architecture as designing. And it's not always that common at all, strangely, that architecture is or could be designing. This suggestion, a proposal, is not meant to say that it's going to replace art or science in architecture. It just means that this is an alternative, and it's a good alternative, I think, because of what I had talked about before, is things have really changed and things are complex and dynamic and interconnected. We're in a new age called the Anthropocene, where there are no longer any natural systems for scientists to study. Every system you can look at, including the North and South poles, all have been influenced by humans. So in some ways, they're all artificially constructed or have had artificial influences on them. So if we're going to have that much influence as humans on all the systems, global systems, then we ought to get much better about doing what we want to do and know why we want to do something. And as designers, as we play a major role in that, it's important for us to begin to understand what it is that this designing approach is all about. So what I wanted to talk about, there are approaches to architectural designing that are pretty common. The first one is bounded design. And in bounded design, everything is framed as a problem, or it's a problem approach. It's a reaction to things that typically we don't like, and we try to get away from them. So it's sort of like backing into the future. So the next one is unbounded design. Those are project-based, and those are usually heuristic and indeterminate outcomes rather than the determinate outcomes from the problem approach. So there's these indeterminate outcomes, and we go through a search process, a heuristic, to find a satisfactory solution. So that's unbounded design. The next one is the notion of bounding design. So how do we go about framing what the space is that we're working with? What are the limits that we're working with? What are the elements that we're working with? None of those things are given or not a given in this. There are no, for instance, there are no natural systems. The systems are what we design or define them to be. We choose to see something as a system with this kind of boundary and these kind of elements and relationships and interconnections. So this bounding design is the process designers go through of actually making those judgments and deciding what they're going to consider as a system and as its reach and expanse. And then there is a fourth approach that deals with expanding design, what I'm calling advanced design. And that's this notion that we can sweep in more from a systems perspective. We can sweep in more perspectives. We can sweep in more information. We can sweep in more understandings than is typical, especially like in the bounded design approach. And I want to concentrate on, for now, on the third and fourth approach. The other two, 1 and 2, are fairly known, especially 1. It's the habit. It's the default approach primarily for almost everything. And this includes businesses. This includes architects. This includes software designers. It includes a lot of people in that. Everything, all action starts with a problem, and people use that term problem all the time, especially to justify taking action. So that's pretty well developed, and the unbounded design, the project-related design, is a little less, but it's still familiar. And I want to talk more about the bounding design, systemic design, and the advanced design piece. So for me, advanced design includes wide design and it includes deep design. So it's expanding, if you would, kind of in greater breadth and in greater depth, our inquiry and our understanding in those two dimensions. And then systemic design, which is important, like I said, because systemics is the logics of design. And that's where we look at the relationships, connections, links, bonds that are between things that sort of define the larger behaviors of systems and their functionality and what emerges in their identities. So these are the 3 areas that I wanted to sort of explore quickly with you. So wide design, for instance, this is just an example. Again, wide design is learning how to ask and answer well-formed questions. And most importantly, it's learning how to ask good questions. And these are just examples of some of the sort of most generalized well-formed questions. True, real, included, desired, prudent, wise, innovative. So that's an important piece to learn how to do well as an architect involving wide design, increasing the breadth. Wide design includes understanding who's included in the process, individuals, groups, teams, design teams, cohorts, clients, stakeholders, decision makers, forming an alliance. And interestingly, graduates of different programs, design programs, will comment to me that, well, in school, they never told us we were going to have to work with all these different people. And we just learned how to design as independent agents. So this is one of those sort of wide design notions. Who's included, who's involved, how are they involved? And then the next one is this notion of deep design. And deep design, this lays out in this kind of layering of, for instance, what's the appearance and experience in a design. And this is the particular instance that we experience in design. This is where most of the attention of the journals are. This is where we have things like our Starchitects and others appear. And this is an important area. This is an important piece of what architectural design is all about, to be able to see and appreciate and be connoisseurs of great designs at this level. However, it's important, and it's particularly important now, is to begin to appreciate what are the deeper causes and B causes and prime causes for these things that appear in the world. Because we can, the movements and the styles in the past, like Bauhaus, École des Beaux-Arts, postmodernism, classic, all those sort of things were sort of, at least for me as a student and a lot of my fellow students, that was like the water that we were immersed in. So like my school, my undergraduate school, was and still is to a large degree based on the Beaux-Arts. And they had the same intention, and they had the same projects, they had the same learning process as that. And we never realized it as students. And then as practitioners, you carry that out with you. But in any case, it's become more self-reflective and aware of the deeper things involved with design. So moving from inspiration to aspiration to explanation to description. So just a quick example. This is a design example using that deep design model. So start with design scope, desiderata, stepping up to a design brief, resulting in a partie, and then it taking form. So this isn't necessarily a hierarchy or anything, but these are all influences and steps that you go through to actually realize something visible in the real world or experiential in the real world. And it's interesting, if you reverse this process, that's a good process for critiquing design, so that you can say, okay, this is what it is. Did it do what it was explained that it was going to do, or what the aspiration was for it, or the inspiration for it, rather than the critique of, well, I don't like how it looks, I don't like the color, and that sort of thing. So the second step is to begin to develop a design brief of performance specifications. And this involves this strange systemic entanglement between nascent architects and mentor instructors. There's a lot of discussion nowadays whether it should be, I guess they call it the sage on the stage, talking to and delivering information, or is it up to the students to teach themselves and to learn on their own? And in this case, it's I want to argue for this kind of interaction between a systemic entanglement between the nascent architects and the mentor instructors. A very complicated relationship, but very rich and necessary. And this is an example, for instance, of domains of learning or of inquiry. These are sets: mindset, knowledge set, skill set, tool set. And those involve or are focused on learning and training and what's called mindedness here. So what I want to do is to just focus on learning and training a bit. The mindedness is much more complex and too complex for this particular presentation. But anyway, to make this case about and looking more closely on knowledge sets, skill sets, and tool sets as being the focus of a educational process or a pedagogical process for architects. And the notion of the scholar practitioner, systemic scholar practitioner, is becoming a designer, gaining the capacitation to be a designer, and being a designer, actually engaging in practice. or praxis. Once you start the process of capacitation, once you start becoming a designer, at the same time you're practicing being a designer. So they're parallel, and they of course don't have even levels, but anyhow, it's an ongoing process that goes on for a very long period of time and doesn't stop with formal learning, for instance. It continues on. So becoming a designer and being a designer involves this integration of these sets and the development of and enhancement of and sort of the curation of the sets and deciding where, when, why, how the knowledge is going to be applied in the real world. And one of the most important points I wanted to make here is that there's a distinction between training and learning that's not always appreciated. So training, one of the things that is attractive is that you get the expected outcomes from what you have as inputs. So if you tell the student that they should do this and that, and this is how it should be carried out, and they do that, and you can watch to see if they've done what you've told them to do. And of course, this is the kind of feedback that is very easy to grade. It can be machine graded. There's right and wrong answers. Did you do it right or did you do it wrong? Did you get the right answer or the wrong answer? Training is important, but it's for expected challenges. And in this complex world that we're in, learning is as important or more important as training, because what you look for is the expected, unexpected outcome. So you watch for the competence in the person to be able to engage in inquiry and come up with a satisfactory solution, a prudent solution to an indeterminate outcome. And you can't know that ahead of time. So there are no right or wrong responses in this case. There are good or better responses or bad responses, but they're not right or wrong. So it's much more difficult to evaluate, but it's still essential to pay attention to both of them, training and learning. And there are 4 elements that I wanted to go through as associated with learning, because it is the one that's more difficult to, like I said, evaluate, grade, to create curriculum for. Anyway, I want to talk about design scholarship, praxis, capacitation, and deep learning. And these, again, are just schemas that I've developed and worked with colleagues in that over some years, developing in this idea of trying to create a foundation, a good solid foundation for a scholar practitioner. So the first one to look at is scholarship. And an example of this is there was a famous, rather well-known study done by the Carnegie Foundation a couple of decades ago now that was influential, wasn't so influential that it really convinced educational programs to change necessarily, but it still was very influential, and people talked about the content of this study a lot. And the point of this was that in the normative university in North America, Europe, and Australia, those places, the measure of scholarship was primarily, and is still in most places, research, teaching, and service. And that's what you evaluate the faculty for. And this was saying there has to be a different kind of scholarship now. There has to be a scholarship of discovery, integration, application, and of teaching. So I've developed this kind of parallel for design scholarship, saying that, okay, in the case of discovery, it's inquiry for action. In this case of integration, it's systemics. The application is service and agency, and teaching is about capacitation. So now, looking at practice and practice, praxis. Social system design ability, practice of design, involves the ability to design a social system at the individual level, at a team level, at a cohort level, and at the client level. So social system design ability is a key part of the ability or practice skills that you need. Design praxis, and this is just another example, is a training and learning to do, to take a stance, to make an approach, to take aim, and to take action, and to fulfill purpose. And obviously, there's a lot more behind all of these things, but like I said, the headings are the most important pieces here to appreciate and understand praxis made up of these different parts. And then this notion of capacitation. So this is a scale for capacitation, a scale of skills, abilities, competencies, knowledge, etc. And this notion that the capacitation involves going up and successfully gaining some different levels of development. Whoops. So that as we go through these different levels and to try to attain this level, at least for scholar practitioners, for architects, as maybe the highest level to be concerned with. And the point in this is that formal academic programs can stop and do stop at different levels. That can stop at the practitioner level, the professional practitioner, the scholar expert, and you get degrees you can get in, at least in the United States, you get bachelor's degrees or master's degrees or PhDs or doctors of design. And each one of those will say that they've reached a certain level of capacitation. Not exactly these, because these are aimed at the notion of becoming a scholar practitioner. So this shows, using the same schema, this shows levels of capability. So as through time, and you gain capacitation and knowing, understanding, and expertise, you also gain depth so that you have the ability to sort of liquefy what you know, what's the crystalline knowledges that you have, and gain new mind and beginner's mind, which is essential for good designers, is the ability to not only gain these levels of capability, but that you can also go back into the depths of sort of beginning over as a new learner on a new project. And of course, again, there's a lot more to this. And this is just an example based on rules of what this notion capacitation is all about. So you go from rote knowing, following rules, breaking rules, which is purposive unknowing, making rules, inseparable from knowing, and no rules, which is embodied knowing. And there are many other kinds of schema showing how you develop meaning, expertise, all that sort of thing in the same sort of level. And it's obviously not a smooth slope in reality, but this gives you the general outline of the process. And then orders of learning. This is just, and this is, I understand this is way too small to be able to read off the slide. You can look at it in greater detail, but the point here I wanted to make is that in learning, there are orders of learning, which means that there are these ascending orders where different kinds of work, different kinds of learning, different kinds of application are done, and they're not necessarily dependent on the lower orders. It's just indicating that it's the work is at a different, the learning is at a different level. And then there's this notion of hierarchy, that there are actually hierarchies of learning. So in this case, it's like going from comprehension, capability, competence, confidence, courage, connection, character, those are all levels. And in a hierarchy, the higher level is always dependent on the lower levels being filled in. So to have capability, you have to have comprehension. It's not like the other notion of order. And then finally, wanted to quickly introduce this notion of deep learning. And this is a fairly complex, again, graphic, but this notion is the one that we're the most, I guess, familiar with, especially in the literature nowadays, where you attend to things that happen in the world, extrinsic events, or you do something and you have extrinsic doing, and you get feedback and you reflect on it, and then it has an influence on your reaction. And that's the single loop learning, where prototypes, iterations all occur. And what's very popular nowadays is this notion of design thinking. And they talk a lot about iteration and prototyping. And essentially, that's primarily dealing with single loop learning. For deep learning, what we want to look at is double loop learning, where the feedback goes back and actually changes the cognitive frame of the designer. So the designer is a different person professionally that then takes action again and does something in the world, does design. So it's the second order. And the triple loop learning, it goes back, feedback actually changes the beliefs and values and the foundational character of the designer. So it's much deeper form of learning. Now, in every case, you don't always have this sort of double loop learning or triple loop learning, but in lifelong learning, as a professional, it's essential to pay attention to learning at those levels, understanding, and that should be the case even in education, is that you start as you get introduced to what learning is all about, and you can begin to manage your own learning, that you go into this understanding of when is it appropriate to stop at single loop learning and just iterate on things in the design, or when is it important to go back into double loop and change your cognitive frames, your filters and your lenses that you're looking at the world. And then when is it important for you to go in with triple loop learning? So thank you for your attention so far. I know that's a lot of information, a lot of complex information, but there's a lot there. And this is a very demanding design to take on, but a very important one, I believe. So I look forward to feedback and maybe more conversations around this. Like I say, there's a lot to this, a lot of people working in different parts of this and developing this idea, and hopefully we'll have a chance to actually see some of this get played out in new forms of pedagogy. Thank you.